Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. They say a mother's love can build a house, but mine was used to keep one standing that was never mine. My name is Helen Walker, and for 3 long years, I drained my savings paying over $136,000 so my son and his wife could live in luxury. I told myself it was sacrifice. I told myself it was love. But on Christmas of 2022, Lisa looked me in the eye and told me I was not welcome at her table. In that moment, I realized I was not a mother to them, only a wallet. And when I finally stopped paying, they were forced to face the mortgage and the truth on their own. I was 62 years old in Houston when the words left Lisa's mouth and cut through me sharper than any winter wind. It was December of 2022. The house decorated with lights that I had strung myself a few ornaments passed down from my parents, glimmering faintly on my little tree. I had gone over to their home at Riverbend Heights that evening carrying a tin of cookies I had baked, hoping to talk about Christmas plans. The neighborhood was alive with music and laughter, but inside their living room, the air felt cold. Lisa stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, her designer sweater perfectly pressed, and she looked me square in the eyes. She said it would be better if I did not come to Christmas this year. She said I did not fit in with their family. I remember Mark shifting uncomfortably beside her, avoiding my gaze. My own son, the boy I had raised through sleepless nights and asthma attacks, the man I had worked extra shifts to put through school, could not find the strength to speak for me. I held the cookie tin tighter in my hands, the warmth of the oven still lingering on the metal, but my fingers trembled. I managed to ask why. Lisa's answer was short, almost rehearsed. Their gathering would be more formal with her parents' friends and business partners, and she thought it would be awkward for me. Awkward, she repeated, as if the word itself was enough to erase decades of sacrifice. I stood there, my throat burning, my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to smile a broken smile that probably betrayed everything I felt. I told them I understood, even though inside I was falling apart. The lights from their 12-foot Christmas tree reflected in the glass windows, glittering against ornaments that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Lisa leaned into Mark, whispering something I could not hear. He nodded, still not meeting my eyes. I set the cookies down on the marble counter that seemed too polished for me to touch. My voice shook as I told them I would see myself out. Walking back to my car that night, the suburban streets glowed with decorations. Inflatable Santas waved cheerfully, neighbors gathered in driveways with hot cocoa. I gripped the steering wheel and sat in silence for a long time before turning the ignition. My hands were cold, and no amount of heat from the vents seemed to warm them. It was not just about Christmas. It was about being told I did not belong in my own son's life anymore. I drove home slowly, headlights reflecting on wet asphalt, tears blurring the lines on the road. When I stepped into my small house in West Houston, the quiet greeted me like an unwelcome guest. The old pine wreath on my door seemed suddenly pitiful. I placed my coat on the chair, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the faint cracks in the linoleum. I remembered the years when Christmas meant Mark helping me hang paper snowflakes in our living room, when Robert, my late husband, would laugh as he untangled the lights. Now, I sat alone, replaying Lisa's words in my mind, each time cutting deeper. I could not sleep that night. I walked from room to room, touching the framed photos on the wall. Mark's graduation picture, his first bike, Robert holding him at the park. Each frame felt heavier than the last. I made tea but never drank it, the cup growing cold on the counter. At 3 in the morning, I sat on the edge of my bed and asked myself how it had come to this. How a mother who had poured everything into her child could end up shut out of his family. The answer did not come only the steady ache in my chest. The following days were a blur. At work, colleagues noticed my silence, but I brushed off their concern. At the grocery store, cheerful clerks wished me Merry Christmas, and I forced a nod. At church, I sat in the back pew, avoiding conversations. It was as if the entire city was wrapped in joy while I carried a stone that no one else could see. When my sister Linda called from Ohio to confirm her own holiday plans, I pretended everything was fine. I told her I was busy, that I had work, that I might skip the season altogether. I could not bring myself to admit the truth. The memory of that evening kept returning sharp and relentless. The way Lisa's lips curled slightly as she delivered her verdict. The way Mark stood silent, his shoulders tense but his mouth closed. The way I walked out carrying nothing but the echo of rejection. I realized then that this was not just another argument or a moment of misunderstanding. This was a line drawn a wall erected between me and the life I thought I still shared with my son. It was the moment I knew something had to change. On Christmas Eve, I sat by my small artificial tree, the same one I had used for over a decade, decorated with ornaments collected from thrift stores and handmade crafts. The living room smelled faintly of cinnamon from the candles I had lit, but the emptiness was overwhelming. Outside, I heard neighbors laughing as they welcomed relatives, the clatter of car doors, the warmth of voices calling out greetings. I wrapped myself in a blanket, held a photo of Robert, and whispered that I was sorry for everything that had crumbled. That night, as I watched the clock strike midnight, a clarity settled over me. I realized that being shut out of Christmas was not the end, but the beginning of something else. I thought about the years of sacrifices, the endless mortgage payments I had been covering for Mark and Lisa, the long shifts, the skipped meals, the late nights spent calculating bills. It all stretched before me like a road I had walked alone, carrying a burden that was never mine to bear. I knew in that moment that the decision Lisa had made for me to exclude me from her holiday table would lead me to make a decision of my own. I folded the blanket neatly, blew out the candles, and turned off the tree lights. The room went dark, but for the first time in years, I felt the faint outline of resolve. Christmas 2022 would not be the memory of being unwanted. It would be the turning point that led me to reclaim what was left of my life. And though I did not yet know the exact steps, I knew this was the moment where everything began to shift. When I think back to how everything began, my mind always drifts to the spring of 2005 when Robert died. He was only 54 strong one day and gone the next from a sudden heart attack. I remember standing in the hallway at Houston Memorial Hospital where I worked, still wearing my scrubs when the call came. The world seemed to tilt sideways. One moment I was a wife, the next, I was a widow staring at a life I had not prepared to face alone. Mark was only 15 then, lanky and awkward, and he needed me more than ever. I did not let myself collapse because he was watching me with wide, frightened eyes. After the funeral bills kept arriving like clockwork, mortgage, utilities, groceries, tuition for Mark's high school, the life insurance barely covered the burial. I took extra shifts at the hospital, moving into the ICU where the hours were brutal, but the pay a little better. Night after night, I walked the fluorescent-lit halls, my shoes squeaking on the linoleum, alarms beeping in the distance. I became used to the steady rhythm of ventilators and monitors, the quiet sobs of families in the waiting rooms. Exhaustion settled into my bones, but I kept going because there was no other choice. Mark needed stability, and I promised myself he would have it. By 2010, Mark had been accepted into the computer science program at the University of Texas in Austin. I remember the pride in his voice when he showed me the acceptance letter, the way he said, "Mom, I did it." Tuition was another story. Even with scholarships and part-time jobs, the bills were overwhelming. That year, I took off my wedding band, a simple gold ring Robert had given me on our wedding day, and walked into a pawn shop on Westheimer Road. The man behind the counter weighed it, scribbled a number on a slip of paper, and slid it across to me. My fingers felt naked as I walked out with cash in my pocket, but I told myself it was worth it. That money went straight to Mark's tuition bill. I never told him. He only saw the smile on my face when I handed over the payment receipt. I kept working nights at the hospital, convincing myself that retirement could wait. I was 50 then, my body already aching from decades of lifting patients, rushing down halls, bending over bedsides. I swallowed painkillers and pushed through. Grace Miller, my colleague and closest friend, used to tease me in the break room. "Helen, join our book club," she said one evening as we shared stale coffee. "It will be good for you." I shook my head and told her I was too busy. Between shifts, bills, and traveling to see Mark on weekends, there was no space for anything else. Grace sighed, patted my arm, and let it go. She saw the dark circles under my eyes, but she knew better than to argue. Mark flourished at school. He called me with stories about his professors, about projects he was excited about coding all night with classmates. Each time I heard his voice, it gave me a burst of strength. I remember one afternoon driving up to Austin, the sun glaring on the highway, just to bring him groceries and fresh laundry. He laughed and said I did not need to do that, but he hugged me all the same. Those moments made the long nights bearable. There was one evening in 2013 that has never left me. I had been on a double shift in the ICU, my legs trembling from standing 16 hours straight, when a message came through my phone. It was a photo of Mark holding a thick envelope, grinning ear to ear. He had just submitted his application for graduation. I leaned against the nurse's station, my head swimming from lack of sleep, but I smiled so hard it hurt. One of the doctors asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. In truth, my body was near collapse. My heart, however, felt light. That single image of my son stepping toward his future was enough to keep me upright. The years blurred together in a haze of work bills and small victories. I learned how to stretch every dollar, clipping coupons, delaying home repairs, ignoring the crack in my kitchen ceiling because Mark's textbooks came first. My retirement account barely grew because every spare cent went toward his education and living expenses. Still, when I saw him walk across that stage in Austin in 2014, his cap and gown slightly crooked, I felt it was all worth it. The applause echoed in my ears, tears blurred my vision, and for a brief moment, I believed every sacrifice had meaning. After graduation, Mark returned to Houston and landed a job in IT. He was the first in our family to earn a degree. I told myself the hardest years were behind us. I thought I could finally ease my pace, maybe join Grace's book club at last, maybe take a trip I had long postponed. But old habits die hard. When he asked for a little help setting up his first apartment, I did not hesitate. When he mentioned student loans, I quietly picked up more hours. I thought I was investing in a future that would one day give back in gratitude and love. As I sit here now, I can still see the tired woman I was trudging through those endless corridors of Houston Memorial, clutching a styrofoam cup of cold coffee, reminding herself it was all for Mark. I can still feel the sting of my empty ring finger, the whisper of grace, inviting me into a world beyond work that I never allowed myself. Those years carved deep lines into my face, but they also carved out a foundation for my son's success. And though I believed then that love and sacrifice would be repaid, I realize now it was only the beginning of a much longer journey, one that would test me in ways I never could have imagined. Mark's life moved quickly after college. By 2018, he had met Lisa Parker, a bright and ambitious woman from Dallas, whose family owned a successful chain of car dealerships. I still remember the first dinner we shared together at a restaurant in downtown Houston. Lisa's smile was practiced, her posture perfect, and she carried herself as if she had already mapped out a future that included my son. She spoke about art galleries, vacations in Colorado, and family parties in Dallas, where the guest list seemed longer than the street I lived on. Mark looked at her with admiration, and I understood in that moment that he was deeply in love. Their wedding was elegant and far beyond anything I could have imagined affording. The Parkers hosted it at a country club outside Dallas. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, waiters floated by with trays of champagne, and the bride's gown shimmered under the lights. I wore a simple blue dress that I bought on sale, and I tried to hold my head high, but I felt the subtle glances. I caught snippets of conversation about business deals and luxury vacations worlds away from my nights at Houston Memorial Hospital. Still, when Mark and Lisa exchanged vows, I pushed aside my unease and told myself this was the beginning of something good. My son had found a partner, and perhaps with her family's resources, his future would be secure. Soon after the wedding, Mark and Lisa began looking for a home. They settled on Riverbend Heights, an upscale community on the west side of Houston, filled with wide streets, manicured lawns, and gates that opened with security codes. The house they wanted was new construction, 4 bedrooms, 3 baths with high ceilings, and an open kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The mortgage was $3,800 a month. The Parkers generously offered to help with the down payment, which eased some of the initial burden. I was relieved, thinking perhaps I could finally take a step back after so many years of carrying responsibility. It did not take long for reality to unravel. New homeowners often face costs they do not anticipate, and Mark and Lisa were no different. The insurance was higher than expected, the property taxes steep, and their taste for furniture leaned toward designer brands rather than secondhand stores. They spoke casually about ordering custom drapes and imported rugs, while I silently calculated the monthly strain. Lisa wanted a new SUV to match the neighborhood, and Mark agreed. The down payment and registration fees ate into their savings. When the first round of unexpected bills hit, Mark called me late at night, his voice low and anxious. He asked if I could help just for a little while until things stabilized. I did not hesitate. I told him I would transfer money to cover the mortgage for a few months. I reasoned with myself that he was newly married, adjusting to adulthood, and it was natural to stumble. Those few months turned into years. From 2019 through 2022, I sent payment after payment, $3,800 at a time, draining my savings and working longer shifts. By the time I finally looked at the total, it was over $136,000. I rarely allowed myself to think of the number. Instead, I focused on the relief in Mark's voice when he thanked me, the assurance that he would pay me back someday, though he never said when. There is one dinner that lingers in my mind. It was late 2019, and we sat around their polished oak table in Riverbend Heights. The house still smelled of fresh paint, the counters gleamed, and Lisa poured wine into glasses that matched perfectly with the plates. The conversation turned to the rising costs, the stress of bills piling up. Lisa sighed dramatically, Mark rubbed his forehead, and the silence hung heavy. I looked at my son, the same boy who once begged me for quarters to buy candy at the corner store, now sitting in a house too large for him to manage. My heart ached. Without even thinking, I said quietly, "I will handle it." The words spilled out soft but binding. Lisa's face relaxed, and Mark exhaled as if a weight had been lifted. I forced a smile even as my chest tightened. That night, I signed myself up for another stretch of sacrifice, one that I did not fully understand. From then on, it became routine. On the first of each month, I logged into my bank account, scheduled the payment, and watched my balance shrink. I skipped dinners out with Grace, telling her I was too tired. I postponed replacing the roof on my own house, telling myself it could wait another year. I declined joining colleagues for weekend trips because I could not spare the expense. Each decision chipped away at my independence, but I convinced myself it was temporary. I told myself Mark and Lisa would eventually stand on their own. I told myself love demanded patience. Lisa often thanked me with a polite smile, but I noticed the way she avoided discussing details. She spoke about social events in Dallas, about vacations her parents planned, about the new friends she had made in the neighborhood. Sometimes when I visited, she would place me in the role of babysitter for their dog, or ask me to wait for a delivery while she ran errands. It was subtle, but the distance between us grew. I was helpful, reliable, always there when needed, but rarely included when it came to their real lives. I tried not to dwell on it. I focused on Mark, hoping to preserve our bond. He called me less often, his conversations shorter, filled with stories about work projects I barely understood. He was rising in his career, surrounded by colleagues his age, while I was still pacing the halls of the hospital, my body aching but my resolve intact. At night, when I returned to my modest home, I stared at the stack of envelopes on my table. Medical bills from my own checkups, letters about my shrinking retirement account, reminders of what I was trading for their comfort. Yet every time I thought about stopping, I remembered that dinner table and the words I had spoken. I will handle it. Those words chained me to a promise no one forced me to make, but one I could not break. Looking back now, I see that moment as the seed of everything that followed. In that well-lit dining room, surrounded by gleaming silverware and expensive wine glasses, I sealed my own fate. I thought I was giving Mark stability, protecting him as I always had. In truth, I was setting the stage for heartbreak. That quiet promise spoken out of love would become the very weight that dragged me to the edge of despair. It did not take long for me to feel the weight of the difference between Lisa's world and mine. Every time I stepped into their house in Riverbend Heights, I felt smaller, as if the polished marble floors and towering ceilings were silently measuring me and finding me lacking. Lisa had a way of smiling that never reached her eyes, a quick lift of the single-story place in West Houston, where I had lived for decades. She asked if the roof still leaked when it rained, and then she laughed softly, shaking her head as if amused by the thought. Mark chuckled without thinking, then looked down at his phone, scrolling as if I were not even in the room. I swallowed hard, pretending not to hear the sting in her words, but something inside me shifted. On another evening, I stopped by unannounced with groceries I thought might help them through the week. I had clipped coupons and filled a bag with essentials. Lisa opened the door, her eyes sliding down to the paper bags in my hands. She took them politely, but placed them on the counter without a word of thanks. Later that night, as I set the table for dinner while Lisa prepared a salad, I overheard her in the hallway speaking on her phone. Her voice was low, but the house was quiet and every word carried. She was talking to her mother in Dallas, her tone sharp with frustration. At least she pays the mortgage, Lisa said, so we do not have to worry about that. Beyond that, I do not have to give her much thought. The words sliced through me. I froze with a plate in my hands, staring at the polished wood of the dining table. My chest tightened, and I had to remind myself to breathe. In that instant, I was no longer a mother, not even a family member. I was a wallet with legs, a convenient solution to a problem they did not want to face. I carried that moment silently for weeks. When Mark called, his voice rushed and distracted, I wanted to ask him if he knew how his wife really felt, but I could not bring myself to start that fight. Instead, I listened as he spoke vaguely about deadlines at work and meetings that stretched late into the evening. He sounded tired, more tired than I had ever heard him. One night, he mentioned offhand that he had asked his manager for an advance on his paycheck just until the end of the month. He said it casually as if it were normal, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. I pressed, gently asking if everything was all right. He changed the subject, assuring me he was fine. The lie lingered in the silence between us long after he hung up. The divide between us grew clearer in small moments. At family gatherings hosted by the Parkers in Dallas, I felt like a guest who had wandered into the wrong room. Their friends discussed investments and vacations in Europe, while I nodded politely, sipping iced tea and praying no one would ask me about my retirement plans. Lisa always looked perfect, her hair styled, her nails painted, her jewelry subtle but expensive. I wore the same dress to 2 different parties, hoping no one would notice. I told myself appearances did not matter, but the humiliation sat heavy on my shoulders. One Saturday, I offered to take Lisa to a community yard sale near my neighborhood. I thought she might enjoy looking for vintage pieces or something unique. She laughed, a light tinkling sound that made me feel foolish. Yard sales are not really my thing. Helen, she said, her eyes drifting toward the leather bag slung over her shoulder. Instead, she mentioned a designer store in the Galleria where she and her friends were planning to shop the next week. I smiled weakly, nodding, but inside I felt the wall between us harden. My own house began to feel like a relic. When Lisa visited once, she glanced at my worn sofa and said it looked comfortable in the same tone one might use to describe an old pair of shoes. Mark sat beside her, nodding absently while checking his email. I wanted to shout at him to remind him that this house had raised him, that every crack in the wall carried the weight of nights I had stayed awake to pay his bills and keep food on the table. Instead, I poured iced tea, my hands trembling slightly, and forced myself to keep quiet. The strain began to show in my health. Long shifts at the hospital drained me, and the knowledge that my hard-earned money was feeding a lifestyle that dismissed me as irrelevant wore me down. Grace noticed the change one night when we sat in the break room. She asked if I was all right. Her eyes filled with concern. I told her I was just tired, that work was harder than usual. She reached over, touched my hand, and said I needed to take care of myself. I nodded, grateful for her kindness, but I did not tell her the truth. How could I admit that my own son and his wife saw me as nothing more than a line item in their budget? In quieter moments, I stared at the balance in my checking account and wondered how long I could keep this up. I had already sacrificed my wedding ring, my weekends, and my retirement years. Now I was sacrificing my dignity. The memory of Lisa's voice on that phone call echoed endlessly. At least she pays the mortgage. The words replayed in my head as I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling. I had become invisible in their lives except for the money I provided. That realization sat heavy in my chest, growing heavier with each passing month. One evening in early 2021, Mark stopped by my house unexpectedly. He looked drawn, his eyes shadowed, his shoulders slumped. We sat at my kitchen table and he picked at a sandwich while avoiding my gaze. I asked him if work was going all right. He hesitated before admitting that he had requested another advance from his company. Just temporary, he assured me, just until things even out. His voice cracked, and I could see the pressure mounting behind his tired eyes. I wanted to reach across the table to remind him that he was strong, that he could manage his own life. Instead, I bit my tongue, afraid of pushing him away even further. He hugged me when he left, a quick embrace that felt both desperate and distant. I stood at the doorway long after he drove off, watching his taillights fade into the darkness. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the sound of the clock ticking steadily on the wall. The weight of Lisa's words, Mark's hidden struggles, and my own endless sacrifices pressed down on me. For the first time, I allowed myself to think that maybe I was not helping them at all. Maybe I was only feeding a cycle that would eventually consume us all. The thought terrified me, but it also lit a spark deep inside a spark that would grow into something much larger in the months to come. By late 2022, my body began to betray me. The years of double shifts and skipped meals finally caught up, and after one long night in the ICU, I staggered out into the morning air, struggling to breathe. My chest felt heavy, every breath shallow and painful. I told myself it was just fatigue, but by the time I drove home, I could hardly climb the steps to my front door. That afternoon, I found myself back in the same hospital where I had spent half my life working, this time as a patient. Dr. Richard Montgomery, a physician I had known for years, leaned against the counter in my exam room, his brow furrowed. He said I had pneumonia, probably worsened by exhaustion. His voice was firm, telling me I needed rest and antibiotics. I laughed weakly, saying rest was a luxury I did not have. He frowned deeper, reminding me I was not young anymore, that ignoring my health would only make things worse. For the first time, I allowed myself to see how fragile I had become. The strong nurse who once rushed through emergencies was now gasping for air after walking across a room. Back home, I sat in my quiet living room staring at the stack of pill bottles on the table. My hands shook as I dialed Lisa's number. I told her I was sick, that the doctor ordered me to take time off, and I asked if they could handle the mortgage for a couple of months until I recovered. Silence stretched on the other end before she finally spoke. Her tone was clipped, impatient. "If you do not send the money, we will fall behind," she said. "You would not want to ruin our Christmas trip to Vermont, would you?" Her words landed heavier than the diagnosis itself. My lungs burned as I struggled to respond. I wanted to shout to tell her my health was worth more than a vacation, but the words tangled in my throat. I mumbled that I would see what I could do, then ended the call. I sat in the dim light of my kitchen, the refrigerator humming, tears sliding down my face. For them, my body breaking down was less important than ski slopes and fireplaces in Vermont. The next day, Mark called, his voice distant and hurried. He asked if I was feeling better, but before I could explain, he launched into a list of bills and expenses, mentioning how tight things were at work. He reminded me of the mortgage due date as if I needed reminding. I told him I was sick, that I could barely stand. There was a pause, and then he said he understood, but his tone carried no conviction. He ended the call quickly, promising to check in later. He never did. I spent the following weeks confined to my home, the antibiotics slowly easing the infection, but not the loneliness. Grace came by with soup, scolding me gently for pushing myself too hard. Ellen from next door brought groceries, insisting I should not be alone. Their kindness warmed me, but it also highlighted the absence of my own family. Mark and Lisa did not visit. They sent no flowers, no meals, no offer to help. Only texts reminding me of due dates. Each time my phone buzzed, I felt my chest tighten, not from illness, but from disappointment. Christmas lights began to appear around the neighborhood, cheerful and bright. From my window, I watched families decorate their yards, children laughing as they draped tinsel over bushes. My own house remained dark. I had no strength to climb a ladder or untangle wires. The small tree in my living room leaned slightly to one side, the same old ornaments hanging tired and worn. I wondered if Mark and Lisa even noticed, or if they were too busy packing their bags for Vermont. One evening, wrapped in blankets on my couch, I saw a photo pop up on social media. Lisa smiling in a boutique, holding up a new coat captioned "Vermont Ready." The comments were filled with friends complimenting her style. Not one mention of the mortgage payment I had sent the same morning, money scraped from my dwindling savings. My body ached with fever, but the ache in my heart was far sharper. When Richard called to check on me, his voice was gentle but firm. He asked if I had anyone helping me. I hesitated before admitting that my son and his wife were out of town. He was silent for a moment, then said, "Helen, you need to start thinking about yourself. You cannot carry everyone else if you cannot even breathe on your own." I promised him I would rest, but deep down I knew rest would never be enough. Something fundamental had to change. As the year drew to a close, I realized the truth. To Mark and Lisa, my sacrifices were invisible, my health expendable, my very existence reduced to a monthly transfer. Their Vermont trip was secure because I had chosen once again to pay. My body could collapse, my lungs could give out, but as long as the mortgage cleared, their lives continued untouched. I lay in bed on New Year's Eve, the muffled sound of fireworks echoing outside, and I knew with absolute clarity that my place in their world had been decided. To them, I was not a mother, not even family. I was the payment that kept their house standing. And that knowledge sat in my chest heavier than any illness ever could. The first week of January 2023, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of bank statements spread in front of me. The numbers blurred together, but the truth was sharp. My savings had dwindled to almost nothing. My retirement account was bleeding out faster than I could replenish it. I realized that every transfer I made to cover their mortgage was carving away the years I had left to stand on my own. For so long, I had told myself it was temporary, that one day Mark and Lisa would take the responsibility. But after being told I was not welcome at Christmas, after hearing Vermont was more important than my health, I knew that temporary had turned into permanent. I called Martin Goldstein, a retired attorney who had once been a friend of Robert's. He invited me to his office, a small room above a strip mall where he still kept bookshelves stacked with legal files. The smell of old paper filled the air as I explained everything. I told him about the mortgage, the 3 years of payments, the home equity line of credit in my name that had been nearly drained. I admitted I was terrified of what would happen if I stopped. Martin listened quietly, tapping a pen against his notepad. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice calm but heavy. Helen, if you keep paying, you will have nothing left. You are not legally obligated for their mortgage, but because you co-signed that equity line, your credit and your retirement are at risk. He explained the difference, drawing little boxes on his pad showing me how my name tied me to debt that was spiraling out of control. If they default, you could be dragged into it. If you keep covering them, you will drain yourself dry. I felt a chill run through me. For years, I had believed I was doing the right thing, but hearing it laid out like that made me realize I was teetering on the edge of financial ruin. Martin looked me straight in the eye and said it was time to protect myself. "You need to cut them off," he said firmly. "It will hurt, but it is the only way to survive this." That night, I sat in my living room holding my phone, staring at the banking app. My finger hovered over the button that would schedule the next transfer. My lungs still ached from the pneumonia, my body weak, but my heart beat steady with a new kind of resolve. I thought of Robert, of the promises I had made to raise our son strong and independent. I thought of Grace telling me to take care of myself. I thought of Lisa's words echoing in my ears, cold and dismissive. I closed the app without making the transfer. My hands shook, but for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of control. The following week, I waited, bracing for the reaction. I knew the due date would come and pass without my money. I imagined Lisa checking the bank account, Mark glancing at his phone the moment they realized the safety net was gone. Days passed with silence. I half expected a call, but none came. My heart pounded each time the phone buzzed, only to find it was Grace or Ellen checking in. I went about my routine, eating simple meals, attending follow-up appointments with Richard, telling myself it was no longer my problem. Then near the end of January, an envelope arrived at their house. I did not see it myself, but I knew because Mark called me that night, his voice sharper than I had ever heard. He said they had received a late notice from the bank. 30 days delinquent. Fees already added. His words came fast, edged with panic. "Why did you stop, Mom? Do you understand what this means?" I closed my eyes and listened, letting the anger spill out of him. When he finally paused, I answered quietly. "It means you finally see the mortgage for what it is. It is your house. Your responsibility. I cannot keep doing this." There was a long silence broken only by his ragged breathing. He muttered that Lisa was furious that her parents were asking questions, that everything was falling apart. I told him I was sorry, but I had nothing left to give. My voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of years finally pressing down. After he hung up, I sat in the dark, my hands folded tightly in my lap. For the first time, the burden shifted. The late notice had gone to them, not to me. The weight of the house, the debt, the choices they had made now rested where it belonged. I knew the fight ahead would be ugly, but I also knew I had crossed a line I would never step back over. The days that followed were strangely quiet. I did not hear from Mark or Lisa again right away. I imagined them sitting at their polished dining table, staring at the notice, calculating how to cover a payment they had never once faced on their own. In that silence, I felt a calm I had not known in years. For the first time, the mortgage was not my shadow. It was theirs. I brewed a cup of tea one evening and sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker on. The world outside looked unchanged, but inside me everything had shifted. I thought of the years of sacrifice, the laughter I had missed, the nights I had worked myself sick, all for the promise of security for my son. And yet in the end, I had been cast aside. Now the balance was changing. They would have to face the reality of the life they had built, and I would have to face my own future one step at a time. The knock on my front door was not polite. It rattled the glass in its frame and sent a shiver up my spine. I had been in the kitchen brewing coffee, trying to start my morning quietly when the pounding came again, harder this time. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked to the door, already knowing who it would be. When I opened it, Mark stood there, shoulders squared, eyes wild. His face was flushed, his breath visible in the cool February air, and I could tell from the way his jaw was set that he had not come to talk calmly. He stepped inside without waiting for me to invite him. His boots clomped against the hardwood, echoing through my modest living room. I shut the door gently, my heart thudding in my chest. "You stopped paying," he said sharply, his voice rising immediately. "What are you thinking, Mom? How could you just cut us off like that?" I took a breath, holding the coffee cup in my hands to steady myself. "I did not cut you off, Mark. I stepped back so you and Lisa could finally face your mortgage. That house belongs to you." He spun around, pointing a finger at me as though he were prosecuting me in court. "We are drowning, Mom. The bank added late fees already. Lisa is sick over this. Her parents are furious. You know what this looks like to them." I set my cup down and looked him in the eye. "What it looks like to them is not my problem. What it is your responsibility. For 3 years, I carried that house almost $140,000 of my savings. I skipped my own repairs, my own retirement. I nearly worked myself into the ground. And in return, when I got sick, I was told not to ruin your vacation." His eyes flickered at that, but he pressed on, pacing in front of the couch. "You do not understand. We cannot keep up with this alone. You are supposed to help us. You are my mother." I felt something in me harden like steel being forged. "I have always been your mother, Mark, but I became your bank account too. I heard Lisa on the phone with her mother saying, 'At least I pay the mortgage so they do not have to worry about me otherwise.' That is how you see me now, isn't it? A wallet with legs." Mark stopped in his tracks, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to argue but had no words. Then his voice rose again, louder than before. "That is not fair. You are twisting this. We are grateful." "Grateful," I repeated quietly, almost to myself. Grateful people do not ban their mother from Christmas. Grateful people check in when she is sick. Grateful people do not tell her that her health is less important than ski slopes in Vermont. He flinched at the words, and for a second I saw the boy he used to be, the boy who hugged me when he graduated, who once looked at me as if I was his whole world. But then his face hardened again, and his voice cracked with frustration. "If you do not step in, we could lose the house. Do you want us to be homeless? Do you want Lisa's family to think we are failures?" I felt heat rise in my chest, anger spilling over into my words. "This is not about me wanting anything, Mark. It is about you facing the reality you built. You chose that house. You chose that neighborhood. You let Lisa push for a lifestyle you cannot afford. And I let myself believe I could protect you from the consequences. But I cannot anymore." He slammed his fist against the back of the couch, making the cushions jump. "You are ruining everything." I stepped closer, my voice low but steady. "No, Mark. I am saving myself. I am not a walking wallet. I am not a backup plan. I am your mother. And if that title does not mean enough without money attached, then maybe you need to decide what it does mean." For a long moment the room was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. His chest heaved, his eyes darting away from mine. He looked at the photographs lining the shelf, pictures of him as a child at the beach, with Robert of us celebrating birthdays in that same living room. His face softened just for a heartbeat, but then it shut down again like a door slamming. "I cannot believe you would do this to us," he muttered, his voice quieter but laced with bitterness. "I never thought you would turn your back." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I whispered almost to myself, I never thought my own son would turn his back on me either. He grabbed his coat from the arm of the chair and strode toward the door. His movements were quick, angry, like every step was an accusation. At the threshold, he paused, his back to me. For a moment I hoped he would turn, that he would say something different, something softer. Instead, he said coldly, "Do not expect me to forgive this." Then he walked out, slamming the door so hard the picture frames rattled on the wall. I stood there in the silence, the echo of his anger lingering in the air long after his truck roared away from the curb. My body shook, but not from fear. It was the release of years of swallowed words finally spoken. My hands trembled as I gathered the coffee cup, rinsing it in the sink with water that ran hotter than my tears. I sat down slowly in my armchair, pulling the blanket across my lap. My heart was heavy, but beneath it was a strange new steadiness. I thought of every night I had stayed awake to keep that roof over his head, every sacrifice that had gone unseen, every kindness that had been repaid with dismissal. Now it had come to this, a shouting match in my small living room, but also a line drawn clear and firm. Outside, the afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. I knew this confrontation was not the end. It was the beginning of a storm that would shake every part of our family. But in the quiet of that moment, I also knew something else. I had finally said the words I needed to say. I was not their bank. I was not their lifeline. I was Helen Walker, a mother who had given enough. And no matter what came next, I would not step back over that line. A week after Mark stormed out of my house, I was sitting on the porch in the cool evening air when I saw Ellen Green walking across the street. She carried a casserole dish covered in foil, her gray hair pulled back neatly, and her expression was hesitant. Ellen had been my neighbor for years, kind and observant, never one to gossip without purpose. She handed me the dish and shifted uneasily on her feet. "Helen," she said softly, "I think there is something you should know." I invited her in and we sat at the kitchen table. She spoke slowly at first, as if unsure whether to share what she had seen. She told me that while scrolling through her nephew's online forums, she stumbled upon usernames connected to local accounts. One caught her attention because it matched Mark's email address. Curious, she followed the trail and found activity logs from poker websites and sports betting apps like DraftKings. Her voice lowered as she admitted she had also seen him late at night, sitting in his truck in front of his house phone, glowing, his face tense and pale as numbers rolled across the screen. My stomach twisted as she spoke. I pressed my hand to my chest, struggling to steady my breath. For 3 years, I had been telling myself that my money was keeping their family safe, that I was helping them build stability. Now the truth was spreading before me like broken glass. It was not mortgage payments or unexpected bills draining them. It was gambling. It was nights wasted on cards and bets money poured into a bottomless pit while I worked myself sick. Ellen reached across the table, her hand covering mine. "I am sorry to tell you this," she whispered, "but I thought you deserved to know." I sat in silence, my mind replaying every late-night call from Mark, every anxious tone when he asked for help. I remembered Lisa's sighs, her excuses about bills, her tight smile when I offered money, all of it now painted in a new light. The designer furniture, the vacations, the constant shortfall. It was not just carelessness. It was addiction. I stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street. The evening lights flickered on neighbors returning from work, families settling in for dinner. My reflection in the glass looked hollow, older than my years. I thought of the wedding ring I had pawned, the nights I had worked through fevers, the holidays spent alone while they lived in comfort. All along, my sacrifices had been feeding a secret hunger that only grew larger with every dollar. When Ellen left, I remained at the window long after darkness fell. My hands gripped the sill until my knuckles whitened. I whispered to myself that I would never again send a payment, not a cent. That house would no longer be carried on my shoulders. I would not be the fuel for Mark's downfall. The following morning, I sat at the dining table with a notebook. I began writing every transfer I had made since 2019, every check, every wire. The total stared back at me, a staggering number I could hardly believe. Over $136,000. My pen shook as I underlined it. The figure felt like a betrayal carved into paper. Later that day, Lisa called. Her voice was tense, brittle, as she asked if I would reconsider helping them just until things settled. She mentioned that Mark was under pressure, that the bank was calling, that appearances mattered with her family. I asked her directly if she knew about the gambling. There was a pause so long I thought the line had gone dead. Then she said quietly, "I do not want to talk about that." My throat tightened. So she knew. She had known all along. I ended the call without another word. I sat staring at the phone, my chest heavy with the weight of years wasted. The truth was finally clear, stripped of excuses and half-truths. My money had not been saving them. It had been enabling them. That night I dreamed of Robert. In the dream, he was sitting at our old kitchen table, his hands folded, his eyes kind but firm. He did not speak, but I woke with the sense that he was telling me I had done enough. The house we had built together had been a place of love, of effort, of honesty. What Mark had created was different. It was a facade held up by lies and by my sacrifice. The next morning, I cleaned my house with a fury I had not felt in months. I scrubbed the counters, swept the floors, opened the windows wide. With every movement, I repeated to myself that I was finished. My lungs still ached, my body still fragile, but my spirit steadied with each breath. I was done carrying them. When the mail came that afternoon, I did not flinch at the envelopes. They were not mine. They belonged to Mark and Lisa. I placed them neatly on the counter without opening them, a ritual I promised never to repeat. Days later, Grace stopped by with coffee. I told her everything, my voice shaking as the story spilled out. She listened, her eyes wide with shock. Then she hugged me tightly. "Helen," she said, "you have to protect yourself now. You cannot let his choices drag you down." I nodded, tears soaking into her shoulder, but inside I felt stronger than I had in years. For the first time, I was not making excuses for my son. For the first time, I was facing the truth. That evening, I sat by the small lamp in my living room, writing in my notebook again. At the top of the page, I wrote one sentence in block letters: "Never again." I stared at the words until they burned into me, a vow I would keep, no matter how much pleading or anger came my way. The sound of my neighbor's children laughing outside drifted through the window, a reminder that life moved on regardless of my pain. I closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and sat in the darkness. My heart was broken, but it was no longer blind. The mortgage I had carried was never mine to bear, and the secret it had been hiding was finally uncovered. And with that knowledge, a line had been drawn that I knew I would never cross again. The invitation arrived on thick cardstock with gold edges, the kind of thing meant to feel important in your hands. It was for a Parker family holiday gathering in late December at their country club in Dallas. I stared at it at my kitchen table, remembering the cold silence of my own living room when Mark left the notebook page where I had written "never again" in heavy block letters. Part of me wanted to throw the invitation away. Another part of me sensed that showing up would be its own kind of truth. I told myself I would go not to reconcile, not to argue, but to let the facts stand where everyone could see them. The club glowed with light as I walked in, chandeliers scattering starbursts across polished floors. Servers moved like a tide through the room with trays of champagne. A string quartet played carols in the corner, and every surface seemed to shine. I wore my navy dress from Mark's graduation and the same simple earrings I had worn for years. The skirt did not swish like silk, the earrings did not catch the light, but they felt solid on me like a promise to myself. I found a spot near an arrangement of white lilies and tried to make my body feel natural, hands relaxed, shoulders down. A cousin I barely knew nodded at me and said I looked well. An aunt asked after my health in a voice that carried only polite interest. I gave short answers. I did not have the energy for small talk that meant nothing. My eyes landed on Lisa across the room. She stood with a cluster of guests, smiling in a way that looked practiced. When she glanced over and saw me, her mouth tightened almost imperceptibly, then she turned back to her circle. I felt him before I saw him, the subtle shift that happens when a person used to control enters a conversation. Thomas Parker moved through the crowd with the confidence of a host who expects to be obeyed. His suit fit like armor, silver hair, combed with care, a drink held lightly between careful fingers. He smiled as he approached, the kind of smile that suggests generosity, though his eyes stayed cool. He greeted me with a warmth that felt staged and suggested we speak in a quieter corner. Several relatives drifted with us, not close enough to join, close enough to hear. He began to speak about how unfortunate tensions had been, how much he valued discretion, how families must sometimes handle delicate matters away from the noise of gossip. His words skimmed like stones across a lake, designed to touch the surface without ever breaking through. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a checkbook. He said he was prepared to make me whole for whatever I had contributed and asked that I continue assisting with the payments for a period just until things settled. He said it would spare Lisa and Mark unnecessary embarrassment and preserve dignity for everyone. Something steady rose in me, not fire, but a clear note like a bell. I thought of the nights in the ICU, of the pond wedding band, of the Vermont photos that mocked my empty living room, of the notebook where I had totaled the last 3 years. I also thought of Ellen's careful voice in my kitchen, of the gambling accounts she had traced, of the mask that had finally slipped. I spoke so that the small half-circle near us could hear, and I spoke without anger because I wanted each word to sit where it landed. I said that if I had not been worthy of a seat at their Christmas table, then I was certainly not worthy to carry their mortgage. I said that my days of rescuing were over, that my money and my time would no longer be harnessed to their image. I said that what needed preserving now was not their reputation, but my own dignity. For a beat, the music and voices in the room seemed to dim. The cousins who had followed us glanced at each other. An aunt pressed a napkin to her mouth. Thomas blinked, the smile falling from his face. The checkbook hung in the air between us like a prop that had lost its meaning. He told me we should not make a scene. I told him the scene had been made long before I walked in, when a mother was turned from a Christmas door and asked only to wire money. His cheeks reddened and he slid the checkbook back into his jacket with a too neat motion. He said that we could speak later. I said there was nothing left to discuss. He left me standing there and returned to the center of the room, his posture stiff. Conversations resumed with a little extra brightness that I felt my hands tremble, and I placed them against the cool edge of the marble ledge to steady them. The tremor passed, and a quiet followed that I had not felt in months, a quiet that came from finally letting truth stand upright without apology. I stayed where I was for a while, letting the night wash over me. A server offered a glass of sparkling water, and I took it. Across the room, Lisa watched me. Then she looked at her father and then down at her hands. For the first time, I saw something in her face that was not contempt or control. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes when the performance ends and there is no script left. A cousin drifted over and asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine. She said that family can be complicated. I said that it often is, and that clarity sometimes looks like cruelty to those who benefited from confusion. She did not know what to say to that, so she squeezed my arm and said she needed to find her husband. When she stepped away, I let out a breath I had been holding since the moment the invitation arrived at my house. I decided I had done what I came to do. I found my coat, slipped it over my shoulders, and walked toward the exit. The night outside was cool and dry, the air sharp in a way that made me feel awake. I crossed the lot slowly, the click of my shoes on the pavement steady, not rushed. In the car, I sat with my hands on the wheel, letting the silence settle all the way into my bones. I did not feel triumphant. I felt clean. The highway unfurled between Dallas and Houston like a dark ribbon. I drove with the radio low, a talk station murmuring about weather and traffic. My mind was clear. I had drawn a boundary in public where flattery and pressure usually dissolved such lines. There was no taking it back now, and I did not want to. Whether Lisa and Mark spun their story as betrayal or strength no longer mattered. I had witnessed the truth of my own life, and that was enough. Back in my house, I hung my coat and stood by the front window for a moment. The street was quiet, a few porch lights glowing, a dog barking in the distance. I made tea and carried the cup to the table where my notebook still lay. The page with the total stared up at me. I closed the cover and slid it aside. The number would not haunt me tonight. The number was a relic. What mattered now was the small, steady place inside me that had survived every pull on it and had finally said no. I went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The room smelled faintly of lavender from a sachet Grace had tucked into my dresser drawer. I thought of her and Ellen, of Richard checking on me after my illness, of the tiny constellation of people who had not asked me for anything but had given me something anyway. I felt grateful in a way that did not glitter but held. Before I turned out the light, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. A new message lit the screen. It was from a number I recognized as Lisa's mother. The preview showed only the first few words. She said that things had become complicated and asked if I had a moment to talk. I watched the screen dim and go dark. I did not open the message. There would be time to respond, and when I did, I would choose my words with care. I lay back and listened to the slow tick of the clock in the hall. I had walked into a room built for show and left with nothing but my own name and a straight back. That felt like enough. Whatever came next would be theirs to initiate. On my side of the line, the decision had already been made. 2 nights after the Parker party, there was a knock at my door that was softer than usual, almost hesitant. I opened it to find Lisa standing on my porch, her coat wrapped tight around her eyes rimmed red as though she had not slept. The sight of her alone without Mark or her parents startled me. She asked if she could come in, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside and let her pass, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the smell of the tea I had just brewed. She sat on the couch, her posture rigid at first, hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened. For a long moment she did not speak. I offered her a cup of tea, but she shook her head. Then, as though a dam broke inside her, she began to cry. The sound was jagged, raw, not the controlled sniffles I had ever imagined from Lisa. She pressed a tissue to her face, her words tumbling out between sobs. She said she had known about Mark's gambling almost since the beginning. It started small, just football bets with friends, then poker nights online. She thought it was harmless until she noticed money missing from their joint account. When she confronted him, he swore it was under control, but it grew, swallowing more and more until it became the reason they were always short. She admitted she had hidden it from her parents, terrified they would see their perfect son-in-law as a fraud. She had hidden it from me too because she was ashamed, and because it was easier to let me carry the weight than to face the truth. Her hands shook as she twisted the tissue into shreds. "I am sorry," she whispered again and again, her shoulders shaking. I thought I was protecting our marriage, but I was protecting a lie. And I treated you like you were less than when you were the only one holding us together. I listened, my heart a mixture of bitterness and pity. For years she had looked at me as though I did not belong, and now here she was unraveling in my living room. I wanted to lash out, to remind her of every slight, every word that cut me, but I also saw a woman trapped as much a prisoner of Mark's choices as I had been. When her tears slowed, I spoke firmly. "Lisa, I cannot fix this for you. I cannot be dragged back into that house or that debt. If you want things to change, you have to make choices for yourself." She nodded, eyes swollen but intent. "Tell me what I should do." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "First, you separate your finances. You open an account in your name only, and you stop sharing credit cards with him. Second, you hire a lawyer. Not one your parents pick, but someone who works for you. Third, if you truly want out, you leave that house even temporarily. You can stay here for 30 days, no longer. But under my roof, you will not ask me for money, and you will not defend Mark's lies." She stared at me as if weighing whether she could take such steps. For a long time, her lips pressed together, her breath shaky. Then she whispered, "I will do it." She repeated it louder, "I will do it." Tears welled in my eyes, though I did not let them fall. For the first time since their wedding, Lisa was not standing across from me. She was beside me. I showed her the guest room down the hall, the one that had been empty since Robert died. She touched the frame of the doorway with tentative fingers, as if uncertain she deserved even that small refuge. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice raw. That night, after she settled in, I lay awake in my own room, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed the conversation, her confession, the way her face broke when she admitted the truth. It did not erase the pain she had caused me, but it shifted something. The balance of enemies and allies had changed. She had crossed a line, not into family perhaps, but into honesty. In the morning, she joined me at the kitchen table. She looked tired but resolute. She asked for the number of Martin Goldstein, the retired lawyer who had counseled me. I slid the card across to her, and she held it like it was a lifeline. She said she would call that day. As she sipped the tea I poured her, I studied her face. For once there was no mask, no polished smile. Only a woman who had seen the ground crumble beneath her and was reaching for steady soil. In her eyes I saw not triumph or defeat, but a beginning. And in my own chest, I felt a weight shift. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with resentment. It was heavy with decision. Lisa had stepped out of the role of my critic and into the role of someone finally willing to fight her own battle. Watching her, their hair unbrushed, hands still trembling, I realized the war in our family was no longer only mine to wage. She was carrying part of it now. When she looked at me and whispered, "I cannot go back to pretending I believed her." And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. The letter came in early March, thick paper stamped with the bank seal, and I knew before Lisa even handed it to me what it meant. She had been staying in my guest room for 2 weeks by then, her face pale, her voice quieter with each passing day. When she slid the envelope across the table, her hands trembled. I broke the seal slowly, my stomach heavy. The words blurred at first, but the meaning was unmistakable. Pre-foreclosure notice. 90 days past due. Fees accumulating. The house in Riverbend Heights was no longer an image of success. It was a liability ready to collapse. Lisa pressed her palms to her face and whispered that she did not know how to tell her parents. I folded the letter carefully, set it back on the table, and said it was not mine to fix. She nodded through tears. She already knew. The fallout arrived quickly. A week later, Mark's car disappeared from the driveway. At first, he told Lisa it had been stolen, but the truth surfaced when a letter from the repossession company arrived. The payments had been missed too many times. They had taken the SUV in the middle of the night quietly, efficiently. Lisa sat at my kitchen counter reading the notice while her shoulders shook. She admitted she had suspected but hoped he was telling the truth. I could not find words to comfort her. Not long after the phone rang, and it was Grace telling me she had overheard gossip at the hospital. A friend in accounting at Mark's company had mentioned his name. There were whispers of him misusing the corporate card charges that did not match client expenses. He had already been warned once, she said, and the managers were watching closely. My stomach sank. I remembered the little sign I had noticed in the way he mentioned asking for paycheck advances. The cracks had been visible, and now they were splitting open. Days blurred together. Lisa moved cautiously, her phone buzzing with messages she did not answer. She spent long hours on calls with the lawyer Martin had recommended, discussing separation of accounts, how to shield herself from liability. I listened from the other room, hearing only fragments, but enough to know she was taking the steps I had asked. Mark finally showed up at my house one evening, gaunt and exhausted. His hair was unkempt, his eyes bloodshot, his hands restless as he stood in my doorway. He asked if Lisa was there. I told him she was in the back room. He said nothing for a long moment, then blurted out that everything was falling apart. The bank, the car, his job. He begged me to help him just this once. I felt my throat tighten, memories of his childhood rushing through me, scraped knees and bedtime stories. But then I remembered the late notice, the Vermont trip, the words Lisa had confessed in tears. I told him I could not. I told him I loved him, but I would not save him again. He stared at me as if I had struck him, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Lisa appeared then, standing behind me, her expression firm, though her eyes were red. She said quietly that she had started the paperwork, that she was done pretending. He looked between us, betrayal and disbelief flooding his face, then turned and left without another word. That night, I sat in the living room long after Lisa had gone to bed. My heart ached with a sorrow I could not name. I had spent decades believing sacrifice would buy loyalty that love expressed in dollars, and long nights would circle back as gratitude. Instead, it had only fed silence and anger. Watching my son unravel was the most painful thing I had ever done. Yet beneath the ache, I felt something steady. Relief. My credit was intact. My retirement, though smaller than it should have been, was still mine. I had placed a wall between his choices and my survival, and for the first time in years, the wall was holding. Weeks passed. Mark's company issued a formal warning, nearly a termination. Friends of the Parkers whispered that the Riverbend Heights house was slipping into foreclosure. Lisa's parents stopped calling me altogether, their silence louder than any insult. Ellen, my neighbor, brought over flowers and told me she admired my courage. Grace hugged me in the church hallway and said she was proud. Even Richard checked in, his voice steady over the phone as he asked if I was managing. Each gesture reminded me that while one part of my life was crumbling, another was slowly knitting back together. One morning, I walked outside and felt the early spring sun warm on my face. Birds sang in the trees, and for the first time in months, I let myself breathe without guilt. Mark was spiraling, yes, but it was his spiral now. I could not hurl myself into the pit with him. I had drawn the line, and I was holding it. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the street come alive, and admitted something quietly to myself. This was justice. Not the vengeful kind, but the kind that returns the weight of choices to the people who made them. My heart hurt, but my shoulders felt lighter. For years I had carried what was never mine. Now it rested where it belonged. And in that quiet, I whispered the word karma, letting it roll softly into the morning air. December arrived with a gentleness that I had not expected. The year had been long, full of storms that tore through everything I thought was solid, but by the time the Christmas lights began appearing on porches, I felt a kind of peace I had not known in decades. My small house in Houston smelled of cinnamon and pine. A modest tree stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments I had collected over the years, some from thrift stores, some handmade by Mark when he was a boy. The lights twinkled softly in the evening, and for once they did not feel like a reminder of what I lacked. They felt like a reminder of what was still mine. My sister Linda arrived first, her laughter filling the house before she even set down her bag. She had flown in from Ohio, determined not to let me spend another holiday alone. Grace followed with a tray of cookies, shaking her head at me when I tried to help her carry them. Ellen came from across the street with flowers and her usual warmth. Later that evening, Richard knocked on the door with a bottle of wine and a smile that softened the moment he stepped inside. My living room was small compared to the houses I had once visited in Riverbend Heights, but it was filled with voices that rose and fell in comfort, not competition. We shared a simple meal: ham and sweet potatoes, green beans and rolls. Linda insisted on carving the ham, while Grace teased her about the uneven slices. Ellen kept refilling glasses, and Richard leaned across the table to tell a story from the hospital that had us all laughing. For the first time in years, I felt the sound of joy in my home, and it did not come from obligation or pretense. It came from people who chose to be there with me. Later, as we moved to the living room to exchange small gifts, there was a soft knock at the door. I opened it to find Lisa standing there, her shoulders hunched, a scarf wrapped around her neck against the cold. She looked unsure, as if she might turn and walk away, but when she saw me, her eyes filled with something I had not seen before: gratitude. She stepped inside quietly, offering a tin of cookies she had baked herself. The room hushed for a moment, everyone aware of the tension, but then Ellen smiled and took the tin from her hands, making space for her on the couch. Lisa sat down, folding her hands in her lap, and for a while she simply listened. When our eyes met, she leaned closer and whispered so only I could hear, "Thank you for letting me start over." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The evening unfolded gently. Lisa spoke more as the hours passed, laughing softly at Grace's stories, asking Ellen about her garden, even smiling at Linda's teasing. She was different, stripped of the polished veneer I had known for years. There was humility in her, and for the first time, I believed her change was real. As the night grew late, I stood by the tree, the lights reflecting in the ornaments. I thought of where I had been just a year before, excluded from Christmas, dismissed as awkward, told my health mattered less than a trip to Vermont. I thought of the late notices, the shouting matches, the discovery of gambling accounts, the humiliation of being treated as nothing more than a source of money. And now here I was, surrounded by people who saw me, not for what I could give, but for who I was. I felt a swell of sadness when my thoughts drifted to Mark. My son was not there, still lost in choices I could not undo for him. The pain of that absence was sharp, but it no longer consumed me. I knew now that I could grieve for him without sacrificing myself to save him. That truth had taken a lifetime to learn. When the last dish was washed and the last present unwrapped, we sat together with mugs of cocoa. The fire crackled in the hearth, the glow wrapping us in warmth. Richard raised his glass and said softly that sometimes the smallest gatherings hold the most meaning. I looked around the room at faces lined with kindness and resilience, and felt his words settle into me like a benediction. I spoke quietly then, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself. I said that I may not sit at the lavish tables I once paid for, but I had found something far more important. I had found myself. And while others still wrestled with the houses they built on lies, I sat in a home built on truth. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was full, like a deep breath finally exhaled. Lisa wiped at her eyes. Linda squeezed my hand, and Grace smiled knowingly. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment rest over me. That Christmas was not extravagant. There were no chandeliers, no string quartets, no designer gowns. There were mismatched mugs, an old tree leaning slightly to one side, and laughter that echoed in every corner. And in that imperfection I found what I had been missing. I knew the road ahead would not be simple. Mark still had battles to fight, and Lisa had choices to make. But my part had changed forever. I had drawn a line, and I had kept it. And in doing so, I had reclaimed something more valuable than any mortgage or reputation. I had reclaimed my dignity. So when I looked at the lights on the tree and whispered to myself that they finally had to face the house and the truth behind it, I felt peace. I had faced my own truth too, and I had survived. If this story touched you, stay with me for more journeys into family justice and the hard but necessary lessons of self-respect. Share your thoughts? Keep the conversation alive and join me again for the next story that reminds us all of the strength we can find when we finally choose ourselves.